So welcome to 11-minute lessons. This question this week is, how is the Bible like a Sunday paper? People still read those, right? It's a thing. So the Sunday paper, in theory, contains various types of literature. You have news reports, editorials, feature articles, advice columns, comics, sports box scores, maybe even a recipe or two. As you move from one type to another, you unconsciously, or you should, adjust how you read. Hopefully you read the comics differently than you read the front page, and maybe you read the opinion page like the comics page at this point. I don't know. But you read sports information differently than you might read political commentary. Your mind knows what you're reading because you kind of know, as you flip from section A to section F, what each section kind of brings. Lifestyle, news, world politics. You know what to expect when you're reading. So we often forget that the Bible also consists of a variety of different types of literature that needs to be read differently. So learning to recognize these differences will help you to read and understand the Bible. So there are three main types of literature in the Bible: narrative prose, prose discourse, and poetry. These are then subdivided even further. In most Bibles, you can often tell the poetry just because the lines are kind of indented. It reads more like poetry. Even in the middle of a letter sometimes, in Paul's letters, you'll see a little poetic section in Philippians and Romans, these little almost hymns in the midst of the letter. So that's a good hint. You can usually tell the difference between prose and poetry by the way the type is set up on the page. You can see that in Job. So the first two chapters of Job are narrative prose. Chapter 3 begins a long section of poetry that continues through chapter 42, verse 6, after which the book concludes with prose. If you get out your Bible, you'll see the difference in how the typeset is. The book of Psalms is mostly poetry. The book of Exodus is almost all prose except for chapter 15. The Gospel of Luke is mostly prose, but has some poetry, especially in chapters 1 and 4. So having noted the basic difference between prose and poetry, then you have subdivided. So prose, the Bible contains various types of prose. Among them are prayers, letters, parables, miracle stories, laws, confessions of faith, mythic stories, and genealogies. So even amongst all different kinds of prose, there's a lot of different kinds. You're going to read a genealogy different than you're going to read a mythic story. Different than you're going to read a parable versus a history. And you have to know, okay, this parable is a parable. It's not a real story, but it's still true. Versus this is a story that's kind of telling about a history. So then you have poetry. And the Bible contains various types of poetry, such as psalms, proverbs, songs, blessings, prophetic oracles. So there are various types of songs, such as hymns of praise, songs of thanksgiving, individual laments, and community laments. So what's really important is identifying the different types of literature. So one question to ask in reading the Bible is, what type of literature am I reading? And that'll influence how you read. Again, I hope you read the opinion page of the newspaper differently than the front page or the comics. So sometimes the Bible will identify the type of literature. For example, Jesus tells us in Luke 15:3, I'm about to tell a parable. Listen up. And then you have the parable of the lost sheep. Sometimes, however, the Bible leaves it up to the reader to identify the literary type. For example, the parables in Luke 15:8 through 10 and 2 Samuel are not named as such. Think about the different styles of cooking. When you go to a Thai restaurant, you're pretty sure you're going to get some Thai food, hopefully. Mexican restaurant, Mexican food. But imagine if you go to a giant buffet with all kinds of different food. Some you may recognize. Like you might see sushi. Okay, I know what that is. Other dishes you might not know. Is that Puerto Rican? Is that Haitian? Is that African? You aren't sure until you try it. Same thing with the Bible. Sometimes if you don't know, you may not know what type of literature you're reading. Is this meant to be read as a history? Is it meant to be read as a fable? Is it meant to be read as a prophetic oracle? And that's where kind of study and learning comes in. So remember, all types of literature can be used to tell the truth. So even though parables are a type of fictional literature, they are profoundly true. Sometimes when a Bible passage does not tell us the literary type, it's difficult to identify what it is. And Bible readers will not always agree. You might have, so like the book of Jonah, people disagree. Some people call it a mythic story. Others think it's a book of prophecy. Others say it's a book of history. Really, it's kind of a mythic satire. It's supposed to be funny, but we miss the humor because it's like 3,500 years ago, and some of that gets lost on us, but it shouldn't. Like, we sometimes, the problem is we read it like it's this serious biblical book of prophecy, but it's supposed to be a funny satire book that has kind of some pointed arguments to it. For instance, in the book of Jonah, Nineveh gets so into repenting, they put sackcloth on all their animals, which is supposed to be funny. Imagine chickens walking around in burlap bags, and cows and pigs. They didn't actually do that. It's over the top. All of Jonah is over the top. But think how long we get so serious about Jonah, and we fight over whether he was swallowed by a fish or not. The point is, it's supposed to be ridiculous, but tell a story. Some of the most profound stories that teach us things are funny. Humor's always been used to kind of tell points. That's the whole reason Saturday Night Live exists. It's not just for humor. They have an agenda, just like any other comedy show. Comedy movies, they often have a deeper story they want to tell, and they use humor to tell it. The Bible's no different. Then you have like the story about the trees in Judges 9. Take a look at that story when you get home. It's probably one you haven't read before. So some readers would say it's a parable. Others, knowing the chief characters of the story are trees, would call it a fable. In either case, the passage speaks truth, even though we know the trees did not actually talk with one another. It's metaphor. But then there are some people who think it's in the Bible. It has to be a true narrative story. These trees talk to one another. So you have arguments about how you're reading the Bible. Sometimes identifying a passage gets even trickier. Take Isaiah 5, 1-7. Verse 1 says that what follows is a love song. But the prophet here seems to be telling a parable of judgment, much like the parable in which Nathan subtly kind of indicts David for his actions against Bathsheba. So verse 7 then tells us about this vineyard, and you have all these different kind of pieces of it that kind of go together that tell this kind of metaphorical story about God and God's people. But it starts out with, this is a love song. Why do you think they did that? See, sometimes in literature and other things, we say we're going to do one thing, and then we switch it around on people just to kind of catch them off guard, to make them think about things a little differently. There's just a comedic songwriter who has a lot of inappropriate songs, but I find him funny. He's a guy named Stephen Lynch. And his idea often is, he says, I'm going to play a sweet love song for you. And he's playing a nice, sweet love song. And it starts off like a love song. But there's always a twist in it that you don't expect coming. There's one song where he's talking about, he's with his girlfriend on a picnic, and they're listening to this one song. It's the first time they kiss, and it's all sweet. But then later when the girl sings, at the very end of her part, it's like, but it wasn't Elton John, it was this other guy. And then throughout the song, they start arguing about who was actually on the radio, and it gets into bigger things. So it's like, we're going to tell it makes you think it's a love song, but it's actually comedy. Or he'll play a lullaby for his daughter, and you think, oh, this is a sweet lullaby, and then it goes really dark really fast. It's setting you up and then sweeping kind of the feet out from under you. That's called subverting the genre. Anyone familiar with the classic Joss Whedon movie, Buffy the Vampire Slayer? So, what Joss Whedon does is he takes this genre of vampire stories, and typically in the genre, you have a pretty blonde girl get kind of coerced into an alleyway with a little voice like, oh, I'm going to go in this dark alley. Things will be fine. And then a vampire jumps out and she's dead. That's how vampire stories go. That's how all of them went. Until Joss Whedon comes and the blonde girl goes into the alley, the vampire comes out, and the blonde girl goes, I'm the vampire slayer, and kills the vampire. It's subverting the genre. It sets you up to start thinking it's going to be one thing, and then turns it on its head, and is able to tell a whole new story. The Bible does this too, but sometimes we aren't aware of the genres, we miss it. I think the biggest example is the flood story. So you had all these different flood stories happening around Israel. Epic of Gilgamesh and so many others. And in all of these, God gets upset with humanity, whatever the God is, and says, y'all stink, I'm destroying the world. I kind of always wondered why we always choose the Noah's Ark story to put in children's Sunday school classrooms. Because it's always like, hey, God's mad at the world, you're all going to die. Welcome, kids, to Sunday school. I mean, talk about like mass genocide in the Bible. Get classroom. What happens, though, in the Bible is they take this story that's so well known and set it up. Here's the flood, God's angry. And then at the end, they flip it on its head where God's like, that's not the kind of God I am. I'm not going to operate like that anymore. They tell the same flood story like everybody else, but they use it to be able to tell a brand new story about a God who isn't petty, a God who doesn't seek vengeance, a God who wants to be in relationship with creation. All those other stories, God stays kind of capricious and angry and vengeful. The Hebrews tell that genre-style story and flip it on its head for the sole purpose of being able to start a new story. But if you aren't aware of all of that, you can come away with thinking, like most Christians often do, God was angry, God destroyed the world just to start over, and God was disappointed in us. But that paints a very different picture of God than it's in the rest of the scriptures. But we still tell the story that way again and again, even though people always ask, this doesn't seem like God. Even my daughter's 8, when she was 4, was like, this doesn't seem to fit who God is. Because we don't understand the genre and what the Bible's trying to do. Does that make sense? So there are all kinds of ways you can identify the literary types in the Bible. It's kind of like today, when you hear a story a long time ago in a land far away, you kind of have a sense you're about to get a fairy tale. I mean, Star Wars is a fairy tale. That's why they start a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. They're setting you up that this is a fairy tale, and it follows the fairy tale genre. Star Wars, Harry Potter, the King Arthur stories, they're all the exact same story, the exact same genre. I mean, if you didn't know Dumbledore was going to have to die, you're not paying attention to the genre. Because what happens to Obi-Wan Kenobi? He goes away, but yet he's still kind of there. Same thing with Dumbledore. It is how the story always goes. Merlin, same thing. All these genres. So the Bible tells these similar stories that are throughout their kind of the Middle East at the time. And to understand what the biblical writers are trying to tell us, we have to understand the genre. Because if you don't, what happens is, it's like you try to do a waltz, but a country line dance song is playing on the radio. Or you're trying to do a swing dance, but it's techno music. There are different kinds of musical genres, and each have a different way of dancing. If you try to dance one to another, you're going to end up looking foolish, and it's not going to go very well. It's the same thing when reading the Bible. If you read one genre, but it's really another one, you're going to end up looking foolish, and it's not going to go very well. That's why it's important to really kind of study and not just read it for as it is, dig down deeper and find out what kind of genre is this? Is it poetry? Is it prophetic oracle? What's the context? Why are they telling this story this way? Does that make sense? Questions, comments, snide remarks? All right, I'll see you next week for another biblical question of some sorts.